Hey guys, tonight we slip into a place where the sky feels way too big and the ground feels way too honest. You're standing on open prairie, the kind of wide, flat distance that makes you suddenly aware you're a small, upright animal with a very questionable plan. The sun is still warm, the grass is whispering, and the horizon looks calm enough to trick you. Then the air shifts, not dramatically, not like a movie, just a subtle tightening. Like the world is pulling a drawstring, and you realize something that every pioneer learns fast. Out here, the wind is not background noise. It is a force with opinions. You probably won't survive this if you treat it like a cute breeze. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, drop your location and your local time in the comments so I can picture you listening from wherever you are in the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are walking with a wagon that creaks like it is already tired of you, and the prairie air tastes clean in a way that almost feels sharp. Each breath is easy, but it is also exposed. There are no big trees to lean against, no cliff face to hide behind, no cozy valley that cradles your little human plans. There is just space. Space above you, space around you, and space for weather to gather speed like it is late for an appointment. Pioneers talk about cold, and yes, cold can hurt you. But wind is the delivery system. Wind is the thing that turns cold into a weapon, heat into a furnace blast, dust into a blinding curtain, and rain into needles. It finds every seam in your clothing, every crack in your shelter, every weak choice you made because you were optimistic. Wind is the prairie's way of checking your work. You learn the first lesson without anyone needing to lecture you. The wind does not arrive politely. It comes in gusts that slap the side of the wagon, then falls quiet for a second like it is reconsidering. Then it comes back harder, pushing at your hat, tugging at loose fabric, making your eyes water until the world turns glossy. Your hair becomes a scientific experiment. This is not a hairstyle. This is wind-assisted self-expression, and you did not consent. When you stop to rest, the silence is never truly silent. The grass hisses, the harness straps click, the wagon cover flutters. Even the insects sound like they are bracing themselves. You look at the open land and you start thinking about walls, not because you are picky, but because you like having skin on your face. There is a mainstream fact that sits under all of this like a foundation stone. As settlers moved across the Great Plains in the 19th century, many of them discovered that the region had far fewer trees than they expected, especially in the central prairies. Timber is precious. If you cannot easily cut logs, you cannot easily build the kind of cabin you grew up imagining. That simple truth shapes everything you do. It forces you to treat shelter as a puzzle you solve with whatever the land gives you. And the land, very often, gives you grass, soil, and stubborn wind. You feel it in your bones when the sky turns that specific prairie colour, a pale, washed-out blue that looks harmless right up until it does not. On some days, the air is so clear it feels like you can see into the future. On other days, a wall of dust rises on the horizon and advances like it has been assigned a target. Your mouth fills with grit. Your teeth crunch softly when you swallow. Your eyes sting. You blink and blink and blink, and the wind keeps pouring dirt into you like it is trying to plant you. A single gust can be strong enough to shove a person sideways if they are carrying something awkward, like a sheet of canvas or a door panel. The prairie loves irony. It will let you build something heavy, then grab the light part and whip it into your shin. It is like the weather is doing slapstick, except the punchline is bruises. You watch clouds skitter overhead, fast and low, like they are late. You learn to read the behaviour of animals. Horses angle their body, cattle bunch up, birds disappear into the lee of anything they can find, even the slight shelter of a wagon or a shallow dip. If everything living around you is acting like the air is about to get violent, you stop trusting your own calm thoughts. The old diaries and letters from prairie life often describe wind in almost emotional terms, as if it is mean, as if it is personal. That is partly because wind makes you feel judged. It pushes on your door. It rattles your roof. It whistles through gaps and keeps you awake until your thoughts get weird. It steals heat from your body so efficiently that you can go from fine to shaky faster than you can admit it. It also carries sound. A distant howl becomes close. A loose board somewhere becomes a drumbeat. A night storm turns your little patch of shelter into a theatre where the wind performs and you're not allowed to leave. There is also a quirky tidbit that floats around prairie storytelling. The kind of thing that sounds half ridiculous until you picture it in the dark. Some settlers claim the wind is so constant that it sings through bottlenecks, cracks, and stovepipes with different pitches, turning a cabin into a haunted instrument. People wedge rags into gaps not only to block drafts but also to stop the eerie whistling that makes you imagine footsteps that are not there. You try to sleep and your wall goes, whee! And suddenly you're wide awake, staring at the ceiling, negotiating with your own imagination. Sleepy, but vigilant. The prairie loves that for you. Wind also messes with fire, which is a bigger deal than you want to admit. A cooking fire is comfort, warmth, and food. But wind can make it temperamental. It can pull smoke back into your face, scatter sparks, and turn a simple chore into a dance where you keep repositioning your body to shield the flame. If you have a stove, the draft matters. A strong gust can make the chimney draw wrong, and suddenly the room smells like soot, and you're blinking through tears. It's not romantic. It is just physics being rude. And then there are the big blows. The kind that make you understand why people talk about stormproof like it is a prayer. The prairie can produce winds that feel like they're trying to peel the world open. When people describe winds approaching 100 miles per hour, they are describing a force that can rip shingles, slam doors, topple poorly braced walls, and turn loose objects into airborne problems. A plank becomes a spear, a bucket becomes a projectile. Even a coat left outside becomes a kite with bad intentions. This is when you stop thinking of shelter as a place to be cozy and start thinking of it as a place to remain attached to the earth. Historians still argue whether some of the most dramatic pioneer storm accounts are exaggerated by fear, memory, or the urge to tell a better story, especially when later retellings turn a hard night into a legend. But even if you shave off the tallest claims, even if you assume people sometimes wrote with a bit of flair, the core reality stays the same. The Great Plains are capable of sustained, punishing winds, and a poorly built cabin is basically an invitation for the weather to redecorate your life. You stand there and you make a quiet decision, not a heroic one, a practical one. You decide that whatever you build, it has to respect the wind. It has to be low enough to avoid becoming a sail, tight enough to avoid becoming a whistle, and solid enough to avoid becoming a pile of lessons scattered across the grass. You look at the land again, and now you do not just see openness. You see exposure. You see where the wind runs fast and where it hesitates. You see that the prairie is not empty, it is active. And you, with your tired hands and your very normal human need for sleep, start craving something that can take a hit and stay standing. You walk the land like you're tracking an animal, except the animal is wind, and it leaves no footprints, only consequences. The prairie looks simple at first glance, like a giant table with a sky lid. But when you slow down, you notice the land has moods. It dips, it rises, it folds into shallow wrinkles. You start paying attention to tiny things because tiny things decide whether your cabin feels like a home or like a drum. The first instinct is the prettiest one. You want to build up high, where the view is wide and the air feels clean. You want to see your wagon and your animals and the line of sunset like a painting. You want the kind of place that looks brave. The wind loves brave. The wind loves anything that stands tall and proud and says, "Look at me." That is basically the wind's favourite snack. So you learn to pick ground like a hunter, not like a tourist. You walk toward a low swale, a shallow draw where the grasses grow a little thicker. The air changes immediately. It is not silent down there, but it is less sharp. Gusts slide overhead instead of smacking you full in the chest. Your eyes stop watering for a second. You can breathe without tasting as much dust. You do not feel like you're being pushed backwards by an invisible hand. This is the first practical rule. You do not fight wind with attitude. You fight it with placement. A mainstream historical fact sits at the core of this decision-making. Many settlers on the plains use natural features, even subtle ones, to shelter their homes, and when timber was scarce, they often chose sites near stream banks, creek bottoms, or draws where there was at least some protection, and sometimes access to water. Water is life, yes, but the shape of land around water is also shelter. A creek bed is not just a line on the ground. It is a slight depression that makes the air behave differently. You keep walking and you look for clues like you're reading a secret message. You find a line of brush and small trees clumped together, and you feel the wind break as you step behind it. You watch how snow or dust is piled on one side of a fence line. You look at the way grass leans, permanently angled like it has been combed by years of pressure. You notice that even a gentle rise can cause wind to accelerate over the top, the way water speeds up as it narrows in a channel. You might not know the math, but your body understands it instantly. Up on a ridge, the gusts hit you like a shove. Down in a shallow hollow, the gusts feel more like a passing complaint. You also learn the danger of gullies and washes. A draw can protect you, but it can also funnel wind like a chute if it lines up with the prevailing direction. You stand at one end of a shallow corridor and you listen. The sound is different. A low rush, like the air is being squeezed. It reminds you of putting your hand near a moving cartwheel and realizing how much power is hiding in motion. You're not looking for the deepest hole, because deep holes come with problems. Water can collect, damp can creep in, insects can throw parties, cold air can settle at night like a heavy blanket you did not ask for. You are looking for a balance, a place where the land gives you a shoulder to lean against without trapping you in a swampy misery. Your second rule becomes clear. Shelter is not only about wind, it is about everything wind brings with it. You walk the edges of a creek and notice the bank has cut into the soil, creating a small vertical face. The ground is firmer here, packed. You test it with your boot, and it holds. Then you take a stick and poke. In some places the soil crumbles like cake. In others it clings. You learn to respect clay, even though clay will later make you furious when it sticks to everything you own. Clay can be shaped, packed, and dried. Sand is easier to dig, but it shifts and it drains too fast. A cabin wants ground that will not give up when the weather starts punching. You begin thinking like someone who plans to be there through a storm. That means you imagine rain driving sideways, not falling politely. You imagine wind pressing on a wall for hours. You imagine your roof trying to lift like a lid. You imagine the moment when your door wants to slam open and your hinges want to leave the chat. This is not pessimism, this is preparation. There is a quirky tidbit that floats around pioneer lore, and it is the kind of strange practical superstition that makes sense when you are tired. Some settlers believed you could judge a good site by watching where spiders built their webs. The idea was that spiders avoided spots with constant harsh gusts because their work would be torn apart. If you saw thick webs tucked into a protected nook, it meant the air there was calmer more often. Is that scientific? Maybe not in a modern lab sense, but it is an example of how people used any pattern they could find. Out here, you take help wherever it shows up, even if it has 8 legs and questionable vibes. You also notice tree lines, even small ones, matter more than you expected. A belt of trees can reduce wind speed on the leeward side, creating a calmer zone. The effect depends on height and density, and it is not perfect. Gusts can spill over and tumble down, but even imperfect shelter is shelter. You stand behind a few cottonwoods and you feel your shoulders drop, like your body is relieved to not be braced against constant pressure. But you do not trust trees completely either, because trees can turn into problems when wind gets violent. Limbs break, whole trunks can fall. If you put your cabin right under the wrong tree, you might survive the wind only to be flattened by your own shade. So you learn to keep a respectful distance, close enough to benefit, far enough to avoid becoming a target. Historians still argue whether the biggest driver of cabin placement was wind protection or access to resources like water, grazing, and travel routes, because choices were rarely made for only one reason. But as you walk, you feel how the wind itself becomes a deciding voice. It does not speak in words, it speaks in pressure, in sound, in how quickly your lips dry out, in how your ears ring when gusts hit just right. You pace out a small area and imagine the cabin sitting low, tucked into a gentle rise so the wind has to climb to reach it. You imagine the door facing away from the worst gusts so it is not constantly trying to blow inward or outward. You imagine where smoke would go, where drifting snow might pile, where rain would run. You imagine hauling materials and you realize you do not want to drag heavy loads up a steep hill every day just to prove you can. Pride is expensive. Your back is already sending you invoices. You make one more check that feels almost silly until you do it. You stand still and listen. Not for dramatic thunder, just for the normal sound of air moving across land. You notice that some spots have a constant hiss, like the wind is always rubbing something. Other spots have pauses, little pockets of quiet. You pick the quiet pocket. You pick the place where the wind seems to have to think before it reaches you. And in that choice, you're not just choosing comfort, you're choosing survival. You're choosing a site that will make every other building decision easier. Because even the best cabin is only as strong as the place you set it down. You stand in your chosen spot and the next problem lands on you with the weight of a full water barrel. What do you build with when the wind is strong, the nights are long, and the nearest hardware store is basically your own imagination? You look around like the land is a pantry. If it does not grow, sit, or sleep on the prairie, you are probably not getting it. You start with a simple inventory. There are places where trees cluster near water, but not everywhere. Logs might be available, but they might be small, twisted, or too few to waste. Stone might be scattered in fields, but sometimes it is absent for miles. Soil is everywhere, but not every soil behaves the same. Grass is plentiful, but you cannot exactly nail grass into a rectangle and call it a day. This is the moment you realize that cabin is not one single recipe. It is a category. It is a negotiation. A mainstream historical fact shapes your options. On the Great Plains, many settlers relied on a sod construction because timber was scarce, especially after the Homestead Act era brought large numbers of people into treeless regions. Sod houses became a practical response to the environment. That fact is not a cute trivia note. It is a reason people survived. But you do not lock yourself into one idea too fast. You consider 3 main paths, and each one has a personality. First, logs. Log cabins sound reassuring because they are familiar. Thick walls, stacked timber, a sense of permanence. If you have access to decent straight logs, you can build a structure that resists wind through interlocking corners and sheer mass. But logs are heavy. Cutting them is work that eats days. Hauling them without proper equipment feels like you are trying to move a sleeping bear. Also, if the timber is scarce, you might be stripping creek banks bare and creating a future problem. Erosion is not dramatic in one afternoon, but it is relentless. Wind is not the only thing that can destroy a home. Water can do it with patience. Second, stone. Stone is the material with the least interest in being pushed around. A stone wall does not flex much. It does not creak. It just sits there, like an argument you cannot win. If you have a field full of rocks, you can pile and mortar your way into something that shrugs at gusts. But stone is slow. You need to fit pieces like a puzzle. You need mortar, or at least clever wedging. Stone also stores cold, so if you do not plan for it, you can end up living inside a refrigerator that the wind keeps restocking. Third, sod. Sod is the prairie's own building block that you cut thick strips of grass and earth and stack them like bricks. The roots hold the soil together. The blocks are heavy, and that weight helps in a storm. The walls can be thick enough to blunt wind and sound, but sod has its own problems. It can shed dust. It can attract insects. It can leak if the roof is not handled wisely. It can also slump if you cut it wrong, or stack it during a wet season. You look at your hands and decide your hands will choose. You do not have the luxury of ideology. You have the luxury of what is nearby. You test the soil first. You dig a small cut with your shovel and lift out a chunk. If the soil is packed with roots and holds together, it is good sod territory. If it crumbles like dry crumbs, you will be building with something that wants to fall apart. You do a second test that pioneers often used in some form, even if they did not call it a test. You squeeze a bit of damp soil in your palm. If it can form a little ball and keep shape, there is clay content. Clay can help bind, but it also swells when wet. If it is mostly sand, It slides through your fingers and refuses to cooperate. Then you scout for stone. You walk a section of ground and count how many rocks you see. Not pebbles, actual stones you can lift and stack. If the field looks like it has been sprinkled with rocks by an annoyed giant, you might be able to build with stone. If it is mostly smooth soil and grass, you will be hunting for rocks like they are rare coins. You also look for wood that is not too precious to spend. Sometimes the only wood is in a narrow ribbon along the creek. If you cut it all, you lose windbreak, shade, and a future source of repair material. So you consider another approach that appears in many pioneer communities, a hybrid structure. You can make a small frame of wood, then fill around it with sod or stone, using minimal timber where it matters most. This is where the pioneers get quietly ingenious. They do not always have to choose one material as a religion. They can blend. There is a quirky tidbit that comes up in stories and makes you blink the first time you hear it. Some sod builders talk about finding snakes or mice inside freshly cut sod blocks, and then discovering them later in the wall, alive and offended. It sounds like a joke until you picture it. You are trying to be stormproof, and your wall is also a tiny apartment building for creatures who did not read the lease. You learn quickly to inspect blocks, shake them, and accept that nature will always attempt to move in. On the bright side, a mouse in the wall is a lot better than the roof leaving entirely. You imagine the wind at 100 miles per hour, and you ask a simple question. What makes a cabin stand up to that? Not elegance, mass and connection. Wind destroys by pushing, pulling, and finding weak joints. So a stormproof cabin is either heavy enough to resist, or tied together well enough to behave like one solid unit, or ideally both. Logs offer connection through notched corners and continuous courses. Stone offers mass and durability. Sod offers surprising mass and insulation, but it needs protection from water and a roof that stays put. Each path demands different skills. Logs demand cutting and notching. Stone demands patience and fitting. Sod demands cutting clean blocks and stacking them so roots knit and weight settles evenly. Historians still argue whether sod houses were seen as temporary stopgaps, or as truly permanent homes by the people who built them, because some accounts describe them with pride, while others describe them as miserable compromises. The truth can be both, depending on the builder, the soil, the year, and how many storms arrived before the garden got established. You make your choice without drama. You decide based on what you can gather without wrecking your own future. If wood is scarce, you save it for the parts that need strength and precision. If stone is plentiful, you use it where weight matters. If sod is abundant, you treat it like the resource it is and you commit to doing it carefully. And that is the real pioneer trick. Stormproof is not about having the best material on paper. Stormproof is about using what you have in a way that respects the wind's methods. The wind pushes at height, so you keep things low. The wind pries at gaps, so you plan to seal. The wind lifts at edges, so you think about how roof and walls lock together. Your cabin is starting to exist in your mind, not as a picture, but as a system. A set of decisions that will either hold or teach you very hard lessons at 2 a.m. with dirt in your teeth. You start thinking about your cabin the way the wind will think about it, which is to say, as something to grab, shake, and possibly embarrass. You do not design for a postcard. You design for survival. Out here, the sky is not judging your taste, but the gusts absolutely are. The first thing you do is lower your expectations. Literally. A tall cabin is a proud cabin, and pride is a wonderful quality for stories and a terrible quality for structures. The higher the walls, the more leverage the wind gets. It is like giving the weather a longer crowbar and then acting surprised when it pries at everything. So you keep the profile low. One story, maybe a loft if you really need it. But you do not build a tower just to feel important. The prairie already knows you are not important. That is kind of its whole vibe. You mark out a footprint on the ground and you notice something interesting. A long skinny rectangle has more wall area facing the wind, and long walls can flex. A squarer shape tends to feel sturdier because the span is shorter and the corners support each other. You're not doing advanced engineering, but you are doing common sense geometry, which is basically engineering with less paperwork. You choose compactness, less surface for the wind to push. Fewer places for it to get a grip, fewer long stretches that can bow. If you need extra space, you think in terms of add-ons that are low and tucked, rather than tall and dramatic. The wind loves drama. Do not feed it. A mainstream historical fact fits neatly here. Many frontier homes and cabins were built small and simple, in part because labour and materials were limited. But the small size also had the practical benefit of being easier to brace and easier to heat. Smaller structures, especially in treeless regions where thick walls of sod or stone might be used, naturally ended up with squat proportions that resisted wind better than taller frame houses. It was not always a deliberate wind strategy at first, but it worked. Then you look at corners, because corners are where a cabin either behaves like a single tough box or a loose stack of wishes. Wind pressure builds on the windward side, then swirls and tugs at edges. At the corners, it tries to peel. If the corners are weak, the whole wall system can start to rack, which is a polite word for turn into a parallelogram and ruin your week. You tighten the corners in your plan. If you're working with logs, you rely on interlocking joints. If you're working with a framed structure, you add diagonal bracing so the walls do not sway. If you're stacking heavy material, you keep your corner bonds overlapping like weaving fingers together. The goal is for the cabin to act as one stubborn unit, not 4 separate walls that happen to be standing near each other. Now the roof. The roof is where wind gets creative. Wind does not only push, it lifts. As it rushes over the top, it can create suction, which is a fancy way of saying it tries to yank your roof off like a lid. If you have ever tried to hold onto a hat in a gust and failed, congratulations, you already understand the concept. You choose a roof shape that gives wind fewer edges to pry at. A gable roof is common because it is simpler to build. 2 slopes, a ridge, done. But a gable has big flat ends that can catch wind, and those end walls can take a beating. A hip roof, where all sides slope down, can be more resistant to uplift because the wind tends to flow around it rather than slam into a tall triangular end. It is also harder to frame, which is why people do not always choose it. The wind, annoyingly, never offers to help with the framing. You also think about pitch. Too shallow, and the wind can skim and pull harder at the edges. Too steep, and you give the gusts more surface to grab. You aim for a sensible middle ground, and you keep the eaves tight. Wide overhangs are lovely for shade, but in a strong blow they can act like little wings. Your cabin does not need wings. Your cabin needs to stay where you put it. You consider the ridgeline mirror too. A long ridge gives the wind more length to work on. A shorter ridge, again, is easier to brace. So compactness keeps winning. The wind is basically forcing you into minimalism. You tell yourself it is a design trend. Then you look at how the roof meets the walls. This joint is everything. If the roof is just sitting there, gravity alone is not enough when the gusts start lifting. You plan connections, not just placement. Rafters get seated properly, wall plates get tied and pinned, heavy roofing materials get secured. Even if you are using something like sod or thatch, you plan to keep it from shifting in sheets. A roof that creeps is a roof that eventually leaves. There is a quirky tidbit that shows up in Pioneer problem solving, and it feels like something you would do at midnight when you are exhausted and the wind is screaming. Some builders deliberately roughen the outside surfaces or add a slightly irregular finish, believing it helps break the wind so it does not slide cleanly and lift as strongly. In modern terms, they are fumbling toward ideas about turbulence and airflow separation. In practical terms, they are making the cabin less like a smooth sail. It is not a magic trick, but it shows the mindset. If the wind has habits, you can mess with them. Another shape choice is partly psychological and partly practical. You keep the roofline simple. No fancy dormers, no tall decorative peaks, no unnecessary bumps. Every bump is a handhold for the gusts. Also, if you have ever tried to fix a complicated roof in bad weather, it is like trying to fold a fitted sheet while being slapped. Simple is kind. You also start thinking about the cabin's silhouette. The wind sees silhouette. A Losa's broad shape blends into the land. A tall, narrow shape stands out. You choose to blend. You are not hiding. You're just not volunteering. Openings are part of shape too. A wall full of large windows is basically a weak spot stretched across the building. You keep openings small and placed where the structure can support them. You align framing around them so loads travel downward. You imagine the wind shoving on the side of the cabin and you ask, where does that force go? It needs to go into the ground, through solid paths, not into a flimsy band of wood around a big hole. Historians still argue whether pioneers consciously designed for aerodynamic wind resistance, or whether the most stormproof shapes emerged mainly from tradition, limited materials, and trial and error. Some settlers brought building habits from wooded regions or from Europe, then adjusted when the plains punished the wrong choices. Others learned by watching neighbours and by rebuilding after a bad season. Either way, the end results often converge on the same principles: low profile, tight corners, simple roof lines, and solid connections. As you lay out the final shape, you get one last reality check. The wind does not care if you're tired. It does not care if you did your best. It only cares about leverage, edges, and weak joints. That sounds harsh, but it is also freeing, because it means the rules are consistent. You can respect them and build accordingly. You step back from your marks in the soil and picture the cabin not as a dream, but as a compact, braced, sensible form that refuses to give the gusts anything fun to do. It is not glamorous. It is not tall. It is not trying to impress anyone. It is the architectural version of keeping your head down and your grip tight. And honestly, that is the kind of personality you want in a house. When the air outside starts running at 100 miles per hour, like it has somewhere important to be. You decide to build with the one material that is everywhere, under your boots, stitched together by roots, and already heavy enough to make the wind regret its attitude. Sod is not romantic. Sod is not cute. Sod is a chunk of living earth, and you are about to turn the prairie into architecture like you're making a cake out of dirt and hope. You start at dawn, because cutting sod in midday heat is a fast track to feeling like a dried out raisin. The grass is damp with dew, the soil holds together better, and your shovel slides in with less resistance. You mark a strip in the turf and push the blade down. The first cut is satisfying in a deeply strange way, like slicing a loaf of bread that smells faintly of summer and clay. You lever up the strip and it comes free in a slab, thick with roots, dark with moisture, surprisingly dense. You lift it and your arms immediately complain. Sod is proof that the earth is not interested in being portable. A mainstream historical fact anchors what you're doing. On the treeless plains, especially in the late 19th century, many homesteaders built sod houses because lumber was scarce and expensive to transport, and because dense prairie sod could be cut into durable blocks that stacked into thick, insulating walls. People did not choose sod because it was trendy. They chose it because it worked when nothing else was available. You set up a rhythm: cut, lift, carry, stack. You aim for blocks that are uniform because uneven blocks create gaps, and gaps are basically tiny doors for wind to slip through and start messing with your sleep. You make the blocks thick enough to hold shape, often several inches deep, and long enough to overlap like bricks. Every time you think, that seems heavy, your cabin quietly becomes more windproof. The wind can shove all at once, but weight is an argument that does not get tired. You lay your first course directly on levelled ground, sometimes on a shallow trench or a base that helps the walls settle evenly. You stagger the joints like brickwork so the seams do not line up in straight vertical lines. A straight seam is a weakness. A staggered seam is a maze. Wind does not like mazes, and neither does rain. The walls rise slowly, block by block. They end up thick, often thick enough that a windowsill becomes a shelf. That thickness is your secret weapon. Wind pressure hits the outside, but the mass resists movement. Also, the interior becomes quieter. The prairie can howl outside, and inside it turns into a muffled rumble, like the world is roaring through a blanket. It is not silence, but it is survivable. You learn quickly that sod walls are not just stacked dirt. The roots matter. Prairie grasses weave the soil into a mat, in good cutting ground. The roots form a net that keeps blocks from crumbling, especially when you handle them. If you cut from poor sod, the blocks break apart like bad brownies. Nobody wants bad brownies, especially not for a house. As the wall climbs, you plan openings with caution. A big hole in a sod wall is a big invitation for collapse if you do not reinforce it. You use wood sparingly where it counts, framing door and window openings with planks or posts, because the earth itself cannot span an opening without help. The wind is always looking for the soft spot. A poorly framed doorway is the wind's favourite prank setup. Now comes the part that separates sod pile from stormproof shelter, the roof. A sod house roof can be done in a few ways, but the challenge is always the same. It must be strong enough to hold weight and secure enough to resist uplift. You cannot just slap on a light roof and call it good. A light roof is a kite with commitment issues. If you have access to poles, you lay them across the top walls as rafters. If trees are scarce, you improvise with whatever straight timbers you can find, sometimes using cottonwood, willow, or any workable species. Over the poles you layer smaller branches, then grass, then soil. Some people add hay, reeds, or a layer of canvas or tar paper if they can get it. The goal is to create a roof that acts like a thick cap, heavy enough that wind cannot peel it away easily. But the roof is also your biggest liability because water does not respect your optimism. When rain comes, it does not just fall, it pushes sideways, it beads, it soaks, it searches. If your roof does not shed water properly, it becomes a sponge. A wet sod roof gets heavier, which is great for wind resistance but not great for structural stress. You want a roof that stays put, not a roof that slowly sinks into your living room. So you shape the roof with a subtle slope and plan a drip edge. You want water to move off, not sit. You also learn that the first season is the hardest. The roof settles, the soil compacts, tiny cracks appear. Wind tries to worry those cracks wider, and rain tries to worm its way in. You patch and tamp and patch again. Your house becomes a living project, like a sourdough starter, except it cannot die because you live in it. Here comes a light joke. Because you need it. You realise home ownership is just endless maintenance, and somehow you're doing it with dirt bricks and vibes. Modern mortgages feel less glamorous now. Do they not? Inside, the air feels different. In summer, the thick walls keep it cooler. In winter, they help hold heat. That insulation is one of sod's great gifts. You can heat a smaller interior space more efficiently, and the walls do not leak cold the way thin boards do. The wind outside can sprint in circles, and the temperature inside stays steadier, like the cabin is politely ignoring the weather's tantrum. Still, sod has quirks, and some of them are downright comedic. A quirky tidbit from sod house life is that grass often grows on the roof, especially after rain, turning your home into a little green hill. People describe roofs sprouting like a pasture, and in some cases animals will nibble at the grass if they can get up there. Imagine stepping outside and realising your house is trying to become a meadow. If you ever wanted a lawn you never have to mow, congratulations! Your roof just volunteered. The downside is that roots can also open channels for water, so you do not let it get too wild. You want the roof to be alive enough to hold together, but not so alive that it starts redecorating the ceiling. And yes, the ceiling can misbehave. Bits of dry soil can sift down, especially in the early months. You might wake up with a little dust on your blanket like the prairie sprinkled seasoning on you. It is not the worst thing, but it is a humbling thing. Another light joke arrives. You finally understand what earth tones really means, because your house is literally shedding earth. You deal with cracks by plastering and smoothing. Some people use a clay mix, sometimes improved with straw, animal hair or lime if available, to create a tighter surface that resists crumbling and drafts. The smoother interior also helps with wind noise and keeps the air less dusty. Wind loves tiny gaps, and plaster is your way of saying, no entry. Historians still argue whether sod houses were actually healthier living spaces than wooden cabins, because while sod can be warm and quiet, it can also be damp, smoky if ventilation is poor, and prone to insects. Some accounts praise the comfort, others describe coughing, mouldy corners, and a constant battle with moisture. The truth depends on the soil, the roof, the season, and how well you manage airflow without inviting the wind inside to rearrange your furniture. You make the final touches with practical stubbornness. You keep the door tight in its frame, you keep the roof edges compact, you patch after every storm. You tamp the roof soil so it binds. You keep a small tool set ready because repairs are not a special event. Repairs are a lifestyle. And when the wind rises, when it starts pressing at the walls like it wants to test you, the sod house responds the way you hoped it would. It does not rattle like a thin board structure. It does not sing through 1,000 cracks. It sits. It absorbs. It holds. The gusts can scream all they like. Your cabin answers with silence and weight, the two most effective arguments on the prairie. You find timber, and suddenly your brain starts speaking in straight lines and right angles. Logs are familiar in a way that feels like comfort food. A tree becomes a wall, stacked in layers, each piece heavy enough to make the wind work for its mischief. But you'll learn quickly that a log cabin is not just a pile of wood shaped like optimism. A log cabin lives or dies at the corners. You pick up an axe, and it feels honest, loud, physical, no apps required. You choose logs that are as straight as you can manage, because a twisted log creates gaps, and gaps are where wind turns into a tiny burglar. You peel bark if you have time, because bark can hide insects and hold moisture. Leaving bark on can also make logs rot faster in some conditions. The work is slow, and you feel every swing in your shoulders. This is the kind of workout where the reward is not fitness, it is continuing to have a roof. A mainstream historical fact sits right in the grain of the wood. Log cabin building techniques were widely used by settlers in North America, especially in wooded regions, because timber was available, and log construction could be done with hand tools. The core strength came from interlocking corner notches, which made the walls act like a single frame instead of separate stacks. That is why people talk about notching like it is sacred. It kind of is. You measure, then you measure again, because the wind is very patient and will wait for you to be sloppy. Your first notch is a saddle notch, a curved cradle cut into the underside of a log so it sits snugly on the log below. It is simple, but it is clever. When the logs settle, the notch tightens. Weight becomes a tightening force instead of a loosening one. That is exactly the kind of logic you want when gusts try to rattle everything loose. You set the first course, then the next, and you feel the cabin taking shape like a slow exhale. Each corner becomes a woven stack. Logs cross, lock, cross, lock. The ends protrude, which looks rustic, but also has a job. Those protruding ends give you more bearing surface, more mass at the corners, and fewer ways for the walls to slip apart. Then you try a different notch, because you hear about it from someone who speaks about wood like it is a philosophy. A dovetail notch angles inward, like a wedge. It is harder to cut, and it demands accuracy, but it resists pulling apart. Wind can shove sideways, but the angled joint fights back by biting tighter. It is like giving your cabin a clenched jaw. Your hands learn the difference between close enough and tight enough. Close enough is how you end up with a cabin that whistles at night and lets in dust like it is offering complimentary seasoning. Tight enough is how you end up with walls that feel solid, like the whole structure is one stubborn object. You also learn about settling. Fresh logs shrink as they dry. They also compress under their own weight. A cabin is always changing in the first months. If your notches are cut well, settling improves the fit. If your notches are sloppy, settling creates gaps that never stop growing. So you cut with the future in mind, which is exhausting, because you are already tired in the present. To keep the walls from sliding or twisting, you use wooden pegs. You bore holes through stacked logs and drive in hardwood pins, sometimes called tree nails. They are simple, but they prevent one log from rolling. In a strong wind, that rolling can turn into a shift, and a shift can turn into a crack, and a crack can turn into a long night where you listen to the walls complain. Pegs stop the slow creep that ruins everything. A light joke sneaks in while you are drilling. You realise you've reinvented the concept of fasteners, and your reward is splinters. Modern screws are suddenly looking like tiny miracles, and you feel personally grateful to whoever invented them, even if you have no way to tell them. Now you think about the wind again, because you never stop thinking about it. Wind does two things that matter here. It pushes on the side walls, trying to rack them. It also creates suction and pressure changes that can tug at the structure and pry at joints. A log cabin can resist racking well if the corners are tight and the walls are tied together. That is the whole game, Make it behave like one box, not a stack of individual parts, so you add bracing where it counts. If you have a framed interior partition, it can help stiffen the cabin. If you have a loft beam, it can tie side walls together. Even a simple cross member can reduce flex. You are building a habit of thinking in triangles and connections, because triangles are the shape that refuses to wobble. Then comes chinking, the art of filling the gaps between logs. Even good logs leave spaces because no tree grows in perfect cylinders. Wind loves those spaces. So you mix a chinking material, often mud and clay, sometimes combined with straw, moss, or animal hair to help it bind. You pack it into gaps, smooth it, let it dry, then patch the cracks that appear as it dries. You do it again and again. This is the part where you understand that weatherproofing is not a single task. It is a relationship. A quirky tidbit shows up in the middle of this messy work. Some builders use whatever is at hand to back chinking, like strips of cloth, bits of wood, even old paper, to help hold the mud in place. You can picture someone stuffing yesterday's news into a wall and thinking, this is fine. It is weirdly practical. Also, there is something poetic about your cabin being held together by dirt, wood, and the remains of your reading material. Another joke, because your mood needs it. You tell yourself this is a luxury feature, like insulated walls, except the insulation is mud you made yourself while arguing with gravity. You plan the door and window frames carefully, because openings are weak points in log walls if they are not handled with respect. You cut the opening after the walls are up, or you frame it as you go, depending on your method. You leave room for settling, because log shrinking can crush a fixed frame. Some builders use a sliding joint or leave a gap above the frame that can be packed later. That way, the wall can settle without splitting the wood. The wind does not have to break your cabin if your own shrinking logs do it first. You also think about the roof connection, because a log cabin is not stormproof if the roof is just resting there like a hat. You seat rafters properly and anchor them to the top logs. People use wooden pegs, notched seats, and strong lashings when metal is scarce. The goal is to make uplift fight the full weight and interlock of the structure, not just a few nails. Historians still argue whether the classic log cabin became a symbol of frontier life, mainly because it was genuinely the most practical shelter in many regions, or because later storytelling elevated it into an icon and pushed aside other common building types. You can feel both truths in your hands. Logs are practical where timber is abundant, but culture loves a clean image, and a log cabin is an image that sticks. As you finish another corner, you run your palm along the joint and feel the tight fit. It is satisfying in a quiet, sleepy way. The cabin is starting to feel like it has muscles, not big showy muscles, more like the kind that just keeps lifting the same heavy thing every day without complaining. When the wind rises, the cabin does not flex much. It does not shiver the way thinner walls do. The logs hold, the corners lock, the pegs keep everything aligned. You still hear the outside world, because the prairie never fully shuts up, but the sound is deeper, less sharp. The wind can push, and the cabin answers with weight and joinery, the two oldest forms of stubbornness. One last small joke, because you deserve it. You look at your hands, covered in resin and dirt, and you think, I have built a box out of trees to keep air out. Humanity is a strange species, effective, but strange. You decide you want a house that argues with wind using pure weight and stubborn silence. So you turn to stone, the material that does not flex, does not flutter, and does not care about gusts acting dramatic. Stone is slow, heavy work, but it has a comforting logic. If something weighs a ton and is stacked correctly, the wind has to bring a whole new personality to move it. You begin by walking the nearby ground like you're hunting for treasure, except the treasure is rocks that make your back sore. You pick up a few and feel their texture. Some are rounded from water, smooth and hard to stack neatly. Some are flatter, broken into plates that can sit more easily. You learn to love flat stones the way a baker loves a good oven. Flat stones behave. A mainstream historical fact fits your choice. Settlers in areas with accessible stone often built stone houses or stone foundations because the material was durable, fire-resistant and heavy, offering excellent stability in harsh weather. Where timber was scarce but fieldstone was plentiful, stone construction became a sensible alternative. Even if it demanded more time and skill, you start with a base. Even the best stone wall suffers if it sits on uneven ground that shifts with frost or rain. So you level and firm the earth, sometimes digging a shallow trench, then laying larger stones as a footing. You want the wall's weight spread out, not perched on a wobbly point like a chair with one short leg. The wind loves a wobble. You do not give it one. Now the real craft begins. Fitting stones. You place a big stone, then try another beside it. The gap is wrong. You rotate the stone, like you are solving a puzzle with no picture on the box. It still does not sit. You chip a bit off with a hammer. It sits better. You place a smaller stone to lock the two larger ones. Suddenly it feels stable. This is how stone walls become strong. Not through perfect stones, but through good relationships between imperfect stones. You learn about bonding. If you stack stones so the joints line up in straight vertical columns, the wall develops weak planes, like perforations on paper that can tear. So you stagger joints, overlapping like brickwork. You also use through stones when you can. Long pieces that extend deeper into the wall, tying the outer face to the inner mass. Without that tying action, a wall can split into layers under stress. The wind does not need to push the whole thing down if it can peel it apart. Then comes mortar. If you have it. Mortar can be lime-based, clay-based, or a mix shaped by whatever you can access. With good mortar, stones stick and gaps fill. With poor mortar, the wall becomes a loose stack that depends only on gravity. Gravity is strong, yes, but wind can shake, and shaking can walk a loose wall out of alignment. If mortar is limited, you learn dry stone techniques. You fit stones tight. You use small wedge stones, called chinks or shims, to lock bigger stones in place. You create friction and interlock. A good dry stone wall can last a long time if built with care, but it demands patience. It demands that you look at each rock and decide where it belongs, like you are arranging a stubborn choir. A quirky tidbit drifts in from old building practices that makes you smile because it is weirdly human. Some builders tuck small objects into walls, a coin, a bead, a bit of glass, sometimes as a charm for luck, sometimes as a marker that says, "I was here." It is not structural, but it is psychological. You are making something permanent, and you want to leave a tiny signature. The wind may not care, but you do. You also learn to think about thickness. A thin stone wall can be strong, but thickness gives more mass and more stability, especially when mortar quality is uncertain. Thick walls also dampen sound. When gusts slam into the outside, the interior feels calmer, like the roar gets absorbed by stone's sheer indifference. Thick walls are heavy, but heavy is the whole point. Then you plan openings. A door in a stone wall is not just a hole, it is a risk. Stone cannot span wide spaces without support, so you need a lintel, a beam, or a flat stone that bridges the gap. If you have wood, you can use a heavy timber. If wood is scarce, you hunt for a long flat stone, which is like hunting for a polite bear. It exists, but it does not want to be found. You set your lintel carefully because it must carry weight above the opening. You place stones above it so the load transfers down the sides, not directly onto the centre. If the load bears wrong, the lintel cracks or sags, and then your doorway becomes a slow-motion problem. Wind pressure on a door can amplify that problem. This is where you start appreciating arches, even if you do not build one. An arch distributes weight beautifully, but it is more complex. Most pioneers keep it simpler, but they still respect the idea of directing forces downward. A light joke sneaks in as you haul a rock that feels like it was carved from pure spite. You realise the stone is not heavy, it is just historically significant. That is what you tell your spine. Your spine does not laugh, but you do. Now you consider wind-driven rain. Stone walls resist wind, but water can seep through cracks, especially if mortar is poor or if stones are irregular. So you think about pointing, pressing mortar into joints, smoothing it and maintaining it. You might plaster the inside with a clay or lime wash, which seals small leaks and reduces dust. The goal is to keep the wall from acting like a sponge. You also plan your roof connection. A stone wall is strong, but the roof is often wood, and wood is lighter. The roof needs to be anchored so it cannot lift under gusts. In some builds, heavy stones are used at the roof edges, or the roof structure is seated into the top of the wall. If you have a timber plate, it gets pinned or set into the masonry. Again, the idea is not to rely on a single point of attachment. You distribute the hold. Historians still argue whether stone houses on the frontier were primarily built by settlers with particular regional traditions and masonry knowledge, or whether necessity forced many people to learn stonework quickly through trial, error, and help from neighbours. Stone is less forgiving than wood. A bad cut in wood can be patched. A badly placed stone can shift the whole wall. Yet people learned, because the weather demanded a learning curve. As the walls rise, you notice something almost emotional. The cabin feels grounded. It does not feel like it might scoot across the grass. It feels planted, like it has decided it belongs there. Wind can whistle and scream all it wants, but the stone does not respond with rattles. It responds with silence, and that silence is a kind of safety. You step inside when the walls are waist high and you test the feel. The air is cooler, steadier. The sound of gusts is less sharp. You can imagine a storm outside and yourself inside. Not fearless, but protected. That is the goal. Not heroism. Just a structure that refuses to negotiate with chaos. One more small joke, because it helps. You look at your pile of stones and think, I am basically making a castle, but without the crown. The wind can be the dragon. Your walls are the answer. You reach the point where the walls feel trustworthy, and then you remember the roof is the part that can embarrass you the fastest. A wall can be thick and proud, but a roof that lifts turns your whole cabin into a fancy wind tunnel with furniture. The wind does not need to knock the structure down if it can simply remove the lid and let weather do the rest. So you treat the roof like a stubborn animal you have to tether. You start with rafters, the ribs of the roof. If you have straight timbers, you choose ones that are not cracked and not overly green. Green wood shrinks as it dries, and shrinkage can loosen joints. You can work with green wood, but you plan for movement. If the wood is already seasoned, it behaves better. Either way, you cut seats so each rafter sits firmly on the wall plate or top course. You do not want a rafter perched on a corner like a bird, you want it nested like a tool in its slot. A mainstream historical fact helps explain why you are so fussy. Many early settlers relied on simple timber framing and hand fasteners, and roof failure was a common problem in severe weather because uplift forces can exceed the holding strength of basic nails or poorly secured joints. That is why builders developed methods to tie rafters down more securely. Even before modern metal connectors became common, you bring in purlins, long horizontal members that run along the length of the roof, supporting rafters and reducing flex. Think of them as the spine bracing the ribs. When wind pushes and sucks, a roof frame can twist. Purlins help keep it aligned. You also add collar ties or cross ties if you can, members that connect opposing rafters to prevent them from spreading. A roof that spreads pushes walls outward. Walls that spread become weaker. The wind enjoys that chain reaction. You do not. Now the real stormproofing begins, tying the roof to the walls. If you have iron, you might use spikes or straps, but many pioneers do not have a box of convenient metal hardware. So you improvise. You use wooden pegs, you cut notches that hook over wall timbers, you lash with rawhide or rope. You use whatever can hold tension and resist jerking. Rawhide is particularly useful because when it dries, it tightens. That tightening becomes a clamp. The wind can tug upward, but it is tugging against a binding that wants to squeeze tighter, not loosen. You feel a strange satisfaction when you pull a lashing snug. It is the feeling of saying no to physics and then backing it up with effort. You also pay attention to the roof edges, because uplift often starts at the eaves. The wind gets under the edge, pressure builds, and suddenly the roof wants to peel, so you keep eaves modest. You secure the first courses of roof boards or thatch with extra care. You avoid leaving a loose lip. If you're using shingles, you overlap them properly and nail them with enough bite. If you have only boards, you lay them tight and secure them with battens, strips that hold multiple boards down. Battens spread the holding force, so one nail does not have to do all the work. The wind loves single points of failure. Spread the load, and you make it harder for failure to start. If you're using sod on the roof, you treat it like ballast. That weight can help a lot, but only if the roof structure beneath can carry it without sagging. You keep the roof frame stout, close spaced, and you make sure the sod layer is even, so weight does not concentrate in one spot. Uneven weight causes deformation. Deformation creates cracks. Cracks invite water. Water adds weight and weakens wood. This is how the prairie turns one small oversight into a multi-week hobby. A quirky tidbit from wind country building practices is the use of dead men. Heavy buried anchors used to hold things down. People bury a log or a large stone with a rope attached and use it as an anchor point. Not just for fences, but sometimes for securing parts of a roof or outbuildings. The idea is simple. If you cannot trust the roof to stay by itself, you give it a leash tied to the earth. You can almost picture the cabin wearing a collar, politely restrained, while the wind throws a tantrum outside. You also think about the ridge. The ridge is the roof's high seam, and it can be a weak line if it is not built well. You cap it securely, overlapping materials so rain and wind cannot pry. If you can, you add a ridge board that gives rafters a continuous surface to nail into. If you cannot, you make sure the rafter pairs meet tightly and are fastened with pegs or lashings that resist separation. Another light joke arrives while you're up there working. You realise you have chosen the worst possible hobby for someone afraid of heights, because the prairie has no buildings. So you become the tall object. The wind notices, and it feels like it is laughing. You laugh too, because if you do not, you will just scream, and that is bad for the relaxing bedtime vibe. Then you consider ventilation, which sounds boring until it is not. A tightly sealed cabin is warmer and quieter, but a roof space that traps moisture can rot. Moisture can come from cooking, breathing, wet clothes, and damp soil. If that moisture rises and condenses in the roof, it can slowly weaken your rafters. So you allow controlled ventilation, small vents or gaps placed where they will not become wind scoops. You want the cabin to breathe like a person wearing a scarf, not like a person with their mouth open in a dust storm. You also think about how wind can create pressure differences. If wind enters the cabin through a gap on the windward side, it can pressurize the interior and push upward on the roof from inside, adding to uplift from outside suction. This is why sealing matters. It is not only about comfort, it is about keeping the cabin from inflating like an angry balloon. Historians still argue how much of early stormproofing was intentional engineering versus craft tradition passed through communities, because many builders did not write down calculations. Yet practices spread. People copied what survived. The wind became a teacher that graded harshly. The lessons that kept roofs attached got repeated. You finish by adding weight and reinforcement where you can. If you have stone, you might place heavy rocks at roof edges in certain building styles. If you have thick sod, it becomes its own weight. If you have boards, you add extra fasteners at vulnerable points. You check every connection with your hands, because your hands can feel looseness better than your eyes can see it. When the wind rises, you listen. The sound on a well-secured roof is different. It is a rush and a thump, but not a flutter. Flutter is danger. Flutter means something is loose and is starting to tear. A roof that holds makes a deeper, steadier sound, like it is absorbing impact rather than reacting with panic. You stand inside and feel the cabin stay calm while the air outside tries to prove a point. The roof does not lift. The rafters do not creak wildly. The structure feels tied to the earth, not just placed on it. That is the goal, a roof that refuses to become airborne, no matter how badly the wind wants to turn your home into a travelling exhibit. And you finally let your shoulders drop, because if the roof stays put, everything else gets a chance to matter. You discover the wind is not only a bully with brute force, it is also a thief with delicate fingers. It slips through a gap the width of a coin, then it pries and worries that gap wider, like it is picking a lock. That is why the next stage of stormproofing is not dramatic carpentry or heroic stone hauling. It is sealing. It is the unglamorous art of telling air, dust, and sideways rain to get lost. You start by walking around your cabin and looking for light, not sunlight coming through a window, but tiny threads of brightness sneaking through seams. If you can see light, wind can get in. If wind can get in, it can whistle, chill, dry out your eyes, and sometimes build enough pressure to make loose elements vibrate. Vibration turns into fatigue. Fatigue turns into failure. So you hunt every seam like it owes you money. A mainstream historical fact sits right in the mud on your hands. Many frontier builders relied on chinking and daubing to seal gaps in log walls, using locally available materials such as clay, mud, lime, and plant fibres. This practice was essential for insulation and weather resistance, and it could mean the difference between a cabin that stayed livable and one that felt like camping indoors. You mix your first batch of chinking material. If you have clay-rich soil, it becomes the base. You add chopped straw or grass to give it tensile strength, the way rebar helps concrete. Some people use animal hair, because hair binds mixtures surprisingly well when it dries. Others use ash, sand, or lime when they can get it, because lime helps resist water and discourages some pests. The recipe changes by region and what is on hand, but the purpose stays constant: fill, seal, and stay sealed. You press the mixture into gaps with your fingers. A stick, whatever works. It is cold and gritty and deeply satisfying, like smoothing frosting, except it smells like earth, and you will not be eating it, even if you get hungry later and briefly consider it. You pack hard, because loose mud falls out. You smooth the surface to shed water, then you wait for it to dry, and you watch it crack, because drying mud always cracks. This is not failure. This is normal. You patch the cracks. You repeat. Welcome to your new hobby. A quirky tidbit shows up in the odd creativity of people who refuse to freeze. Some settlers use shredded paper, cloth scraps, or even dried manure fibres as part of a filler backing behind the mud, especially in larger gaps. It sounds gross in a modern sentence, but it is basically recycling with a survival motive. Fibres help the mud stay in place. Also, nothing makes you feel like a pioneer quite like realising your wall insulation could once have been a cow's lunch. You also learn that sealing is not just between logs. If you have a framed cabin, you have joints between boards, corners where materials meet, and spaces where the wall meets the foundation. Wind loves the foundation line because it is often uneven, so you use packed clay, stones, and careful fit to close that seam. If you have gaps near the floor, you feel them at night as cold streams on your ankles. That is the wind reminding you it lives here too unless you evict it. Inside, you consider plastering. A thin interior coat of clay plaster can transform a drafty wall into a smoother, tighter surface. It also reduces dust. It is messy work, but it changes how the cabin feels. You go from air is moving through here to air is staying where it is told. You can actually hear the difference. The whistle becomes a muffled sigh. It is the sound of the wind being disappointed. Now you move to the roof liner, where sealing gets even more important. A roof joint that leaks does not just drip. It can soak. A small leak can rot wood over time or soften sod layers. So you seal where the roof meets the wall, using packed clay, tight boards, or overlapping materials. If you have tar paper or canvas, it becomes a precious barrier layer. If not, you rely on clever overlaps and gravity. Water wants to run downward. You guide it away from seams. Then you face the chimney, the place where you literally invite a controlled hole in your roof, because you want heat and you want food that is not raw misery. Chimneys are tricky in wind because gusts can create downdrafts. Smoke can push back into the cabin. Sparks can fly. So you build the chimney with care, sealing the roof penetration, and you add a cap or spark arresting setup if you can. Even a simple stone or metal hood can help. Not perfect, but better than letting wind treat your chimney like a flute. Light joke time, because you deserve one. You realise you're building a house that is mostly about controlling air, and yet you still have to let some air in so you do not suffocate. You're basically negotiating a contract with the atmosphere. Terms and conditions apply. The atmosphere does not read terms and conditions. You also think about pests, because sealing gaps is not only about wind. Small openings are invitations for mice, insects, and any creature that wants a warm place. You do not panic about it. You just become practical. You pack tight. You use harder materials at the lowest points like stones and stiff clay, because soft packing can be chewed. A stormproof cabin is also a mouse-proof cabin, at least in your dreams. You test your work with your senses. You light a small candle and watch the flame. If it flickers near a seam, air is moving. You hold your hand near a joint and feel for a cold stream. You listen for whistles. You do this on a windy day, because calm days lie. Windy days tell the truth. Historians still argue how much frontier sealing practices varied by cultural tradition versus local material necessity, because people brought building habits from different regions and then adapted. Some groups favoured lime-based plasters when they could produce lime. Others leaned on clay. Some used moss as a natural gasket. Some relied on wooden strips, battens, or carefully fitted boards. The diversity makes sense. You do not need one perfect method. You need something that works with what you have. Now you meet the reality of maintenance. Seals crack with drying. They shrink in cold. They swell in wet. They loosen as the structure settles. That means stormproofing is a cycle. You keep a bucket of mud mix ready. You keep straw tucked away. After a hard blow, you do an inspection, not because you love chores, but because you love sleeping. Another light joke sneaks in as you patch a seam for the third time. You start calling it interior decorating. You do not have wallpaper, but you do have mud. And honestly, mud has character. Very earthy, very grounded. Literally. When a real wind arrives, you understand why this work matters. The cabin feels less like a sieve. The air inside stays calmer. Dust does not pour through every crack. The sound changes from sharp and whistling to low and distant. You still hear the storm, but it is outside where it belongs. Your fire behaves better because drafts are controlled. Your warmth stays close to you instead of being stolen inch by inch. This is the quiet kind of victory. No big dramatic moment, just the steady comfort of a sealed space that refuses to be invaded by invisible fingers. The wind can push the walls, it can tug the roof, but it cannot slip in and make itself at home. And for a pioneer, that is what stormproof really means. Not invincible, just not easily bothered. You look at a window and realise it is basically the cabin admitting weakness. It is a hole you intentionally cut into your protection because you want light, you want air, and you want to see if the sky is doing something suspicious. The problem is that wind also wants in, and it has no interest in politely knocking. A window is glass and thin framing, and in strong gusts it becomes the easiest part to break, rattle, or rip loose. So you treat windows like a necessary risk, not a decorative feature. A mainstream historical fact explains why pioneer cabins often feel dim inside. Many early frontier homes use small windows, sometimes just one or two, because glass was expensive and fragile to transport, and because large openings weakened walls and increased heat loss. Small windows were not just thrift, they were structural and practical choices, especially in harsh climates. You start by keeping window openings small. A narrow window is easier to brace, easier to shutter, and less likely to fail. You place windows where the wall can support them, not right at a corner where the structure needs strength. You also avoid placing big openings on the side that faces the strongest prevailing winds, because that is basically telling the gusts. Try this spot first. You choose thick frames if you can. A thicker frame resists twisting. You anchor it well into the wall material, whether that means pegging into logs, embedding into stonework, or tying into a wood frame. You make sure the frame is square, because a frame that's even slightly out of true can bind the sash or leave gaps that wind exploits. A tiny gap becomes a whistle becomes a draft becomes you waking up angry at 3 a.m. with cold ears. Now the glass, if you have it, you handle it like it is made of spun sugar. Glass panes in the pioneer era can be small, and that can actually help. Multiple small panes held by muntins, the thin strips dividing them, can be more resilient than one big pane because each piece has less area to flex. Also, if one breaks, you have not lost the entire window. It is still bad, but it is less instantly catastrophic. If you do not have glass, you improvise. Oiled cloth can serve as a light-admitting barrier, stretched tight over a frame. It lets in a soft glow, but it is not transparent. You trade view for resilience. The wind can still press it, but it will not shatter like glass. It may flap, though, so you tension it and secure it well. You do not want your window doing a little flag routine every gust. A quirky tidbit that feels almost unbelievable until you imagine the desperation. In some remote areas, settlers use flattened animal bladder membranes as translucent window material because it can be stretched and it blocks wind while allowing light. It is not a luxury. It is survival engineering. It also makes you grateful for modern windows because yes, you can appreciate history and still not want your house to be sealed with creative biology. You move on to shutters because shutters are the window's armour. A shutter turns a fragile rectangle into a reinforced barrier when storms arrive. You build shutters from sturdy boards, cross-braced so they do not warp. The brace matters. Without bracing, boards can twist and pull away from hinges under wind pressure. With a diagonal brace, the shutter becomes a stiff panel. You mount shutters with hinges that are strong and set deep. You do not want the hinge screws pulling out of soft wood when the wind presses. If you have metal hardware, you use it. If not, you improvise with leather hinges, wooden pins, or whatever can swing and hold. You add interior latches as well, because wind can work a loose shutter like it is trying to pick a lock. You also plan a way to secure shutters quickly. Storms do not always give you a polite warning. If the sky darkens and the gusts start slapping, you want to be able to close and latch without wrestling. A simple bar that drops into brackets can lock a shutter from inside. You want something you can do with cold fingers. Now you address the weak point that many people forget, the frame-to-wall joint. Even a strong shutter does not help if the window frame itself is loose. So you seal around the frame with chinking can, plaster, or packed clay, depending on wall type. You eliminate gaps. You also add trim strips that overlap seams because overlapping is your friend. Water and wind have a harder time with layered barriers. Another light joke slips in as you wrestle a shutter into place. You realise you're basically building tiny doors for your windows, which means your cabin is now a building full of doors, and you are the doorman. The wind tries to get in, and you just stand there like, sorry, list is full. You think about what happens if a window breaks during a storm. The immediate danger is not just cold air, it is pressurization and debris. Wind entering can increase pressure inside, which can push up on the roof and strain connections. Also, rain and dust can flood in, soaking bedding and making everything miserable. So you keep emergency materials handy. A board, a piece of canvas, even a spare shutter panel can be used as a quick patch. The goal is to close the opening fast. Historians still argue how widely shutters were used on the frontier versus being more common in certain regions and wealth levels, because some cabins had minimal openings and relied on small panes that could be covered with cloth, while others, especially later or in more resourced areas, incorporated more refined carpentry. But the principle remains consistent across accounts. Protecting windows during high winds is crucial, and people who learned that lesson did it repeatedly. You also consider interior curtains, not as decoration, but as draft control. A heavy cloth hung over a window can reduce cold air spill and catch some dust if tiny gaps remain. It is not a substitute for sealing, but it adds comfort. In winter, every layer matters. In summer, it can keep harsh sun from overheating the interior. When the wind rises, you watch how the shutters behave. A good shutter does not rattle much. It sits tight, pressed against the frame, distributing load through hinges and braces. A bad shutter bangs and shudders, and that noise gets into your bones. Sound is part of storm stress. Quiet is part of safety. You learn to chase quiet. One last joke. Because your mind needs a soft landing, you look at your tiny windows and think you have invented the original privacy mode. Nobody can see under. And honestly, with the wind outside, you're not exactly hosting a dinner party anyway. By the end of this work, windows stop being fragile ornaments and start being managed vulnerabilities. You do not eliminate the risk, you reduce it. You turn glass and cloth and frames into a system. Small openings, strong frames, tight seals, reliable shutters. The wind can still roar, but your cabin no longer feels like it is one lucky pebble away from becoming a very drafty ruin. You learn a door is not just an opening. It is a lever the wind can grab with both hands. A door is big, flat, and hinged, which means it is built in movement. In a hard gust, a poorly built door can slam, warp, or even blow inward if the latch gives up. That is not only annoying, it can be dangerous, because a sudden flying door can injure people, scatter embers, and turn your warm interior into an instant weather exhibit. So you build the door like you are building a shield. A mainstream historical fact helps explain the style you choose. Many frontier doors were simple plank doors made from vertical boards held together by horizontal battens and diagonal bracing, because that design used minimal milled lumber and resisted warping. The diagonal brace was crucial, helping the door stay square under its own weight and under stress. You begin with the frame, not the door itself. The frame must be strong, square, and anchored into the wall. If the frame twists, the door will never sit right. A door that does not sit right creates gaps, and gaps create drafts and rattles. So you set upright posts, or you build a solid jamb, and you tie it into the wall structure. In logs, that might mean carving a channel and allowing for settling so the wall can move without crushing the frame. In stone, it might mean bedding the frame into masonry and making sure it cannot shift. Then you build the door slab. Vertical boards are your base. You choose boards that are thick enough to resist bending. You lay them tight edge to edge. Then you nail or peg battens across the back. One near the top, one near the bottom, and often one in the middle. But you do not stop there, because without a diagonal brace, the door will sag over time. Sag is the enemy. Sag turns a tight door into a door that scrapes the floor, sticks in the frame, and leaves a gap at the top corner that the wind will absolutely exploit like it is a hobby. So you add the diagonal brace running from the lower hinge side up to the latch side. This transfers the weight back into the hinge corner, keeping the door square. It is one of those simple bits of craft wisdom that feels like magic because it works so well. Now hinges. Hinges are the door's bones. If the hinges fail, nothing else matters. If you have iron strap hinges, you use them because they spread load across more of the door surface. A tiny hinge concentrates stress. Stress snaps things. Strap hinges are long and strong. If iron is scarce, you improvise with heavy wooden hinges or leather hinges. Leather seems flimsy until you remember that thick hide, dried and maintained, can be surprisingly tough. Still, you know leather can stretch. So you design with extra support and you accept that you may need to replace it. You mount hinges with deep fasteners, not tiny nails that pull out. If you can, you through bolt with pegs or use clenched nails, bent over on the inside so they cannot slip back out. This is storm thinking. You do not assume calm conditions. You assume the door will be yanked and slammed repeatedly. A quirky tidbit appears in the odd inventiveness of people living with constant wind. Some settlers hang a heavy curtain, or even a second inner door layer, like a simple vestibule, to cut drafts and reduce pressure surges when the outer door opens. It is not fancy. It is basically building an airlock for humans. When you step in, you close one barrier before opening the next. It feels excessive until you experience a gust that tries to pull the door right out of your hand. Now the latch is where pride goes to die. A weak latch will fail at the worst moment. You need something that stays shut even when the wind pushes and sucks. A simple wooden bar that drops into brackets can be more reliable than a delicate mechanism because it has mass and no tiny parts. You can also use a hasp and pin, or a stout wooden latch that engages deeply. The key is that it must not bounce open when the door vibrates. You also think about the threshold. The bottom gap under the door is a favourite place for wind to sneak in, because it is hard to seal while allowing the door to swing freely. You shape a threshold board, slightly raised, so the door closes against it. You add a door sweep, which might be a strip of leather, cloth, or flexible wood that brushes the floor and blocks drafts. It does not have to be perfect. It has to reduce the flow. Then you seal around the frame. You pack chinking, plaster, or felted material in the gaps. If you have cloth, you can make a simple gasket along the jamb, a strip that compresses when the door closes. This reduces rattling and drafts. It also reduces noise, and noise is stress. A door that bangs all night is like living with a drum you never asked for. Like joke time, you realise you're building the world's most serious door for a cabin that is basically one room, which is like putting a bank vault door on a pantry. But then you remember the pantry is also your bedroom, kitchen, and entire life. So yes, the door deserves respect. You also consider how the door opens. If it opens outward, wind pressure can help keep it shut, but a strong gust can also rip it open if the latch fails and the wind catches the edge. If it opens inward, the wind can push it in, testing the latch and hinges constantly. Different builders choose different approaches based on local wind patterns and convenience. You choose the direction that best resists the most likely gusts, and you make sure the latch system matches that choice. Historians still argue how standardized these door building practices were across different frontier regions, because material availability and cultural building traditions varied widely. Yet the physics are the same everywhere. A door that is braced, hinged well, and latched securely as a door that stands a chance in violent wind. A door that is flimsy becomes the storm's favourite toy. You add one more safety detail. You keep something heavy nearby that can brace the door from the inside during extreme conditions, like a stout bar or a piece of timber you can wedge into place. It is not elegant, but it works. In an emergency, you want redundancy. One latch is good, a latch plus a brace is better. When a gale arrives, you notice how the door behaves. A well-built door feels solid. It might flex slightly, but it does not chatter. It does not rattle like loose teeth. The frame holds, the latch stays engaged. The draft at your ankles is reduced. That is a huge comfort, because feet and ankles are where cold sneaks in and makes you miserable first. You place your palm against the inside of the door and feel the pressure changes as gusts hit. It is like the wind is pushing on a wall that pushes back. That is what you want. A conversation where the wind speaks loudly and your cabin answers, no. Another small joke. Because you deserve it, you start thinking of your door as your cabin's facial expression. A tight door is a stern look. A loose door is a goofy grin. You want stern. You want the kind of door that makes the wind reconsider. By the end, the door is no longer a weak hinge point. It is a reinforced barrier that closes firmly, seals reasonably, and stays latched when the world outside is moving at speeds that make your ears pop. In a storm-proof cabin, the door is not a polite entrance. It is a line you hold. You finally understand the wind is not only trying to push your cabin sideways, it is also trying to make it walk, not literally with little feet, but by nudging, rocking, and slowly shifting anything that is not properly married to the ground. A stormproof cabin is not just strong up top, it is committed down below. So you start thinking like the earth is part of the structure, not just the surface you happen to sit on. You begin with the simplest truth. If the base is crooked, everything above it spends its life fighting. Wind finds that fight and escalates it. So you level the footprint carefully, scraping high spots, filling low spots, tamping until the ground feels firm under your boots. You do not need perfection, but you need consistency. A cabin does not tolerate a foundation that behaves like a mattress. A mainstream historical fact fits right into your shovel work. Many settlers built cabins on stone piers, wood sills, or simple trench foundations because fully poured foundations were rare in early frontier settings. In frost-prone regions, shifting ground could crack walls and twist frames, so builders often used stone or raised sills to reduce rot and stabilize the structure. It was basic, practical building shaped by climate and limited materials. You choose a method that matches what you have. If stone is available, you set stone piers at corners and along wall lines. You pick larger stones for the base and smaller ones to shim and level. Each pier becomes a solid point that resists sinking. You check height, because uneven piers create a twist. Twist becomes stress. Stress becomes cracks. Wind loves cracks. You do not. If stone is scarce, you use wood sills. You place thick timbers on the levelled ground or on a bed of gravel if you can manage it. Gravel drains water away, which helps prevent rot. Rot is the slow, quiet storm that arrives even on calm days. You seat the sills firmly and make sure they are straight, because these are the cabin's shoes. If the shoes are bent, the whole body walks weird. Then you address the cabin's tendency to slide. A slick sill on wet ground can shift under repeated pushing. So you add friction. You roughen contact surfaces. You set sills into shallow trenches so the earth hugs them. You pin sill corners together with joints that do not open under lateral force. You want the base to resist the first inch of movement, because the first inch is how the wind starts winning. Now you think about uplift again, but this time from the viewpoint of the entire building. Roof ties help, yes, but if the whole cabin is light, a violent gust can lift edges or rock the structure on its supports, so you add anchoring that connects structure to ground. If you have posts, you set them deep. A post sunk into the earth is not just a support, it is an anchor. The deeper it goes, the more soil mass it engages. You tamp soil tight around it. If the soil is loose, you pack stones around the base to lock it. You pay attention to the angle of the grain and the shape of the hole, because a sloppy hole creates voids and voids become wobble. You also use cross-bracing under the floor, diagonal members that keep the cabin from racking at its base. Even if walls are strong, a flexible base can twist. Bracing turns twisting into a harder problem for the wind. It forces the cabin to behave like a unified box. Then you consider tie-downs, the pioneer version of telling your cabin, you live here now, permanently. You can drive stakes into the ground and run ropes to the roof structure or sill, but stakes can pull out if the soil is soft, so you improve the anchor. You bury a heavy log or large stone and tie to that. The weight and the surrounding soil resist pull-out. You might not call it an anchor system, but that is what it is. It is the same concept as modern ground anchors, just with more mud and fewer instruction manuals. A quirky tidbit shows up here, the kind of practical weirdness that sounds like folklore until you think about how desperate a gale can make you. Some settlers bury old wagon axles, wheels, or large iron scrap as dead anchors, tying ropes from the cabin frame to these buried objects. Iron does not rot quickly like wood, and the shape gives the soil something to grip. It is frontier recycling at its finest. Your cabin is literally tethered to yesterday's transportation problems, like joke time, because this is the part where you realise you are basically putting your house on a leash. You are not building a home, you are training a very large but stubborn pet to stay in the yard. You also consider drainage, because water undermines anchoring by softening soil. Soft soil loses grip. A storm can bring rain and wind together, and that combination is mean. So you grade the ground around the cabin so water runs away. You dig shallow ditches or swales that guide runoff. You place stones or packed clay at vulnerable spots to prevent erosion. The goal is to keep the ground under your supports firm, not turning into pudding. If you have a crawl space or shallow cellar, you reinforce it carefully. A void under a cabin can become a place where wind pressure changes create odd suction and drafts. And it can also become a moisture trap. You vent it in controlled ways and keep the edges sealed. You do not want the cabin's underside acting like a wind instrument. You also think about how frost moves the earth. In cold climates, freeze and thaw can jack stones upward and shift supports. So you try to set piers below the frost line when possible. Or you accept that you will need seasonal adjustments. You keep shims handy. You watch for new gaps. You listen for new creaks. It is not paranoia. It is maintenance. Historians still argue whether frontier builders understood wind forces in a formal way, or simply responded to repeated failures with increasingly robust practices, because written descriptions often focus on survival and labour rather than structural theory. Yet the consistent use of heavier bases, deeper posts, and tied connections suggests people learned quickly what held and what did not. You test your anchoring during moderate wind, because extreme wind is not the moment for first experiments. You watch the cabin during gusts. You look for any sign of rocking. You listen for the base creaking. You check ropes for slack. You check stakes for loosening. If something moves, you fix it while the weather is still in a negotiable mood. Another light joke arrives as you re-tamp a post hole. You start wishing the wind came with customer service. You would like to file a complaint. Press 1 for stop pushing my house. Press 2 for return my hat. You also add weight strategically. If your cabin is light, you store heavy items low. Barrels, sacks, stone. Anything dense goes near the base. This is not decoration. This is ballast. The lower the centre of gravity, the less likely the cabin is to rock. It is the same reason a keel keeps a boat stable, except your boat is on land and the waves are air. Then you do one more thing that feels surprisingly important. You connect interior elements to structure. A heavy stove gets secured so it cannot tip if the cabin shifts. Shelves get braced so they do not become falling hazards. You're not only saving the building, you're saving yourself from your own belongings trying to participate in the storm. When a strong blow finally hits, You feel the difference in your body. Instead of a jittery shudder, the cabin feels planted. The pressure comes, but the base does not scoot. The corners do not hop. The floor does not tremble in that sickening way that makes you imagine the whole structure sliding off its supports. The wind can howl, but the cabin is tethered, weighted, and grounded. Final light joke, soft and sleepy, you realise your cabin is now more committed to the earth than some people you know. It is anchored, faithful, and not going anywhere. Even when the wind tries to start drama, you breathe slower. The storm can still be loud, but loud is manageable. What you cannot manage is movement. And because you have tied your shelter into the ground itself, the wind is forced to waste its energy on noise instead of relocation. You learn stormproof living is not only what you build, it is what you do on the day the sky changes its mind. A cabin can be strong, but a storm is a whole event, and events have routines. On the prairie, routines are the difference between feeling terrified and feeling busy, which is basically the same as feeling safer. The day begins with signs that are not dramatic unless you know what to look for. The air feels charged, like it has been scrubbed too clean. The wind comes in bursts, then pauses, like it is taking a breath before shouting. Animals act odd. Chickens huddle. Horses angle their bodies away from the gusts. Even your own skin feels the shift. Goosebumps that arrive without a temperature change. A mainstream historical fact fits the way people react. Many frontier communities developed practical storm routines, especially in regions prone to blizzards, thunderstorms, and prairie windstorms. Diaries and accounts often describe early preparations, like securing roofs, bringing animals close, and storing fuel and water inside, because once a storm hit, travel could become dangerous or impossible for hours or days. You start with the outside because outside is where loose things become weapons. You walk the yard and pick up anything that can fly. Buckets, tools, boards, barrels with lids that are not tight. You do not leave a shovel leaning against a wall. A gust can knock it over, and the noise alone will make you think the cabin is failing. Also, the shovel blade can gouge something important. You store it flat or inside. You secure the wagon. You face it into the wind if you can, because a broadside wagon is a sail. You tie down the cover. You lash wheels. You wedge something to keep it from rolling. You have learned that wind can push a heavy object if it has time. Time is the wind's favourite ally. Then the animals, if you have a barn, you bring them in. If you do not, you choose the best shelter available, a draw, a fence line, the lee of the cabin, anything that breaks the force. You do not tie animals where they can be struck by flying debris, and you do not leave them where they can bolt into the storm. You give them water now because later it may be frozen, spilled, or inaccessible. You feed them early because a fed animal stays calmer. You also check fences. A loose gate can slam and break. A broken fence can let animals scatter. In a storm, chasing a cow is a comedy until it becomes a tragedy. You tighten what you can quickly. You accept that some things will break no matter what, but you reduce the odds. Now you come inside and shift into cabin mode. You close shutters if you have them. You latch them securely. You check window frames for any gaps that might whistle. You close vents that face the wind. But you keep enough ventilation to avoid smoke build-up. You inspect the door latch and you set a brace nearby. You set up the stove or hearth for a long run. You bring in extra firewood, more than you think you need, because storms always last longer than your confidence. You keep kindling dry. You keep matches or flint close. You clean ash so the stove draws well. A smoky cabin in a storm feels like being trapped in a bad cooking experiment. A quirky tidbit appears in the small strange habits people develop under stress. Some settlers keep a wet cloth hung near the stovepipe joint or chimney area, not as a fire solution, but as a quick smoke filter if a gust causes backdraft and the cabin fills with soot. The cloth catches some particles and gives you something to breathe through. It is not perfect, but it is an example of improvisation that makes sense when the air turns hostile. You set water inside, a bucket, a barrel, whatever you can spare. Wind-driven storms can freeze pumps, contaminate open water, or make trips outside risky. You also set food within reach, not fancy food, just something that requires little cooking if your fire struggles. Bread, dried meat, dried beans, whatever your pantry is. You're preparing like you are going to be stuck, because you might be. Then you do the quiet sealing ritual. You walk along the baseboards and feel for drafts. You stuff cloth into a crack. You press a little clay into a seam. You wedge something small under the door sweep. These are tiny gestures, but in a storm, tiny gestures add up. Each draft you block is a piece of comfort you keep. Light joke time, you realise you're basically arguing with air using socks and mud. If anyone ever tells you pioneer life is glamorous, you now have the correct facial expression ready. You choose a safe interior spot. Not directly under a chimney if you worry about collapse. Not pressed against a window. You move bedding and valuables away from openings. You place a lantern where it cannot tip. You secure anything heavy on shelves. A storm is not the time to discover your pottery collection wants to become a projectile. As the wind rises, you listen and interpret. A steady roar is one thing, or a sudden flapping is another. Flapping means something is loose outside or on the roof. You do not run out immediately unless you must, because storms punish bravery. Instead, you wait for a lull. You use that lull like a small window of permission. You go out only if the risk of not going out is worse than the risk of going out. That calculation becomes a daily skill. Historians still argue how much pioneer storm survival depended on individual preparedness versus communal support. Because in some regions, neighbours could help each other secure buildings and shelter animals, while isolated homesteads had to rely on their own routines. You can feel the difference in the way you operate. If you have people nearby, you might share labour and warnings. If you are alone, your routine must be sharper, because nobody else is coming in the middle of a gale. When the storm peaks, your job becomes keeping the interior stable. You tend the fire carefully. Too hot and sparks become dangerous. Too cool and you'd lose warmth. You keep a kettle of water simmering to add humidity if the air gets too dry and dusty. You check the chimney drawer. You crack a leeward vent briefly if smoke backs up, then close it again. You're managing airflow like a conductor, except the orchestra is weather. Another light joke sneaks in as you adjust a vent. You realise you're doing climate control, except it is manual, and the settings are slightly less miserable and miserable. If dust comes, you cover your mouth and nose, you dampen a cloth, you reduce interior movement to keep dust from swirling. If rain drives sideways, you move buckets under leaks. Because leaks are not moral failures, they are just something that happens. You will patch later. For now, you keep bedding dry. Dry bedding is morale. If the wind is strong enough to shake the door, you brace it. If you hear something hit the wall, you do not panic immediately. Debris strikes happen. You wait and listen for structural sounds, a crack, a sustained tearing, a change in how the roof sounds. You learn to distinguish between noise and danger. The wind produces plenty of noise. Your cabin, if it is failing, produces different noises, deeper, more persistent. You keep a lantern ready for darkness. Storms can turn day into twilight. You do not waste light, but you do not sit in complete darkness either, because darkness amplifies fear. A small steady flame is calming. It makes the cabin feel like a place, not a cave. As the storm continues, the routine becomes almost hypnotic. Tend fire, check seals, listen, breathe, drink water, feed the animals if they are inside. Speak softly if you are with others. Silence can be peaceful, but silence can also make every creak feel like doom. A calm voice helps. By the time the wind starts to ease, you are tired, but you are also proud in a quiet way. Not because you defeated the storm, you did not. Nobody defeats the prairie. You simply stayed organised while the world tried to shake itself apart. And that is the real ritual. You do not meet the wind with drama. You meet it with a checklist, a steady hand, and a cabin that is ready to be boringly durable. The storm passes, and the first thing you notice is not silence. It is the weird way silence arrives in pieces. The wind does not stop like a switch. It tapers off, stutters, then leaves behind little gusts that feel like an afterthought. You step outside and the world looks slightly rearranged, like the prairie got bored and tried redecorating with whatever it could pick up. This is where the truth shows up. Not the heroic truth, the practical truth. Sometimes the cabin holds beautifully. Sometimes it does not. Sometimes it holds in most places, but fails in one small, cruel detail that turns into a big problem fast. You start your inspection the way you would check your own body after a fall, head to toe, slow and honest. You look at the roof first. Roof damage is common because uplift and flapping attack edges and seams. If you see missing shingles, peeled boards, torn thatch, or a sod roof that's slumped, you do not stare in denial. You start planning repairs immediately, because water always follows wind like an uninvited friend who shows up holding a suitcase. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment of triage. Frontier settlers often rebuilt and repaired repeatedly, because severe weather regularly damaged roofs, outbuildings, and fences, and materials were too scarce to replace everything cleanly. Salvage and patching were normal. A cabin was not a finished product. It was a structure that evolved through repairs. You check the ridgeline, you check the eaves, you look for nails or pegs that pulled loose. If you see a board lifted, you push it back and fasten it again. Sometimes with an extra batten to spread the hold. If a rafter cracked, you do not throw up your hands, you sister it, meaning you fasten a new timber alongside the damaged one to restore strength. You might not call it sistering, but you do it. Two pieces acting together are stronger than one sad piece trying to cope. Light joke time, because otherwise you will cry into your tool bag. You discover the wind has an eye for your most expensive materials, which is impressive, considering the wind does not have eyes. Still, it somehow finds the one good board you saved and decides it belongs in the next county. Next, you check the walls. With logs, you look at corner joints and chinking lines. With stone, you look for shifted stones, new cracks, mortar that powdered out. With sod, you look for slumps, bulges, and roof leaks that soften the wall tops. You press gently with your hand. A solid wall feels stubborn. A compromised wall feels spongy or loose. If you find cracks, you patch them while they're small. You scrape loose material, wet the area slightly so new clay binds, then pack fresh mix in. You smooth it and let it dry. You accept that drying means more small cracks. You patch again. The cabin becomes a conversation with the weather where you keep replying, "No, actually, if the door frame shifted, the door might stick or swing oddly. That is a sign of settling or racking." You resquare what you can. You add a diagonal brace inside the wall if the structure allows it. You wedge shims where needed. You tighten hinges. You do not ignore a sticking door, because a sticking door is the cabin whispering that forces went somewhere they should not have. You also check the base. If the cabin rocks, even slightly, you find out why. A pier stone may have shifted. A sill may have settled into softened soil. You re-level using shims, stones, and tamped earth. You improve drainage if you see water pooling. You learn that storms do not just break things, they reveal where the ground itself is unreliable. A quirky tidbit floats in from the habits of people who live with repeated damage. Some settlers mark their repair dates on a beam or a door frame, carving a tiny notch or writing a year, like a quiet record of the cabin's battles. It is not bragging. It is a reminder. You look at the marks and realize the house has a memory. Also, it is a neat way to remember how many times you have said, "This is the last repair," and then immediately lied. Now comes the harder part. Sometimes the damage is not a patch job. Sometimes a corner joint opened, a stone wall bowed, or a roof section collapsed enough that you have to rebuild a portion. You do not treat it as failure of character. You treat it as a math problem. What can be saved? What must be replaced? And how do you improve the weak spot so the same thing does not happen again? You salvage first. You collect intact boards. You straighten nails if you can, because metal is valuable. You reclaim hinges, latches, and straps. You save pieces of canvas. You gather fallen stones and stack them neatly for reuse. This is not hoarding. This is frontier supply chain management. Another light joke, because you need the emotional support. You realize you have become a professional scavenger on your own property. Your job title is now Chief Executive of picking up stuff that blew away. You also learn that some failures come from a chain reaction. A single broken window lets wind pressurize the interior. That pressure lifts the roof more. The roof loosens, rain enters, wood swells, fasteners loosen further, The next gust hits and the roof loses another section. In that sense, stormproofing is not only building strong parts, it is preventing small failures from cascading. So you adjust your design through repairs. If a window broke, you add stronger shutters or reduce the opening size. If the roof edge lifted, you tighten connections and reduce overhang. If a wall cracked near an opening, you reinforce framing around it. If the cabin rocked, you improve anchoring and drainage. Each repair is an upgrade, a quiet evolution shaped by real force. Sometimes the biggest decision is relocation. If you realise the site is a wind funnel or the soil stays soft and shifting, you consider moving the cabin or building a new one in a better micro-shelter. Moving a whole structure can happen in some communities with enough people and rollers, but it is hard, more often. Relocation means rebuilding. It is a brutal choice because it costs time and energy, but it can save years of repeated repairs. Historians still argue whether the toughest pioneer cabins survived mainly because of superior building knowledge or because of luck and local conditions like wind direction, storm path, and terrain shelter. You can see both sides. A well-built roof time matters, but a slight change in storm angle can also matter. A thick wall helps, but a falling tree can still ruin your day. The debate is real because weather is not a controlled experiment. It is chaos with patterns. You also face the psychological part. A storm that damages your shelter shakes your sense of safety. Even if you fix everything, you may still listen for every gust, wondering if it will become a roar. So you build habits to calm your mind. You keep repair materials ready. You keep tools organised. You keep a routine for inspections. Predictability is comfort when the outside world is unpredictable. You invite help if you can. Neighbours may come by, not with speeches, but with hands. A few people can lift beams safely. A skilled mason can reset stones faster. Someone with spare boards can trade. Community becomes another kind of reinforcement, not nailed to the cabin, but wrapped around your life. One more light joke, soft and sleepy. You realise the prairie is basically running a subscription service called maintenance, and the payment is your labour. You cannot cancel. You can only renegotiate terms by building smarter. When repairs are done, the cabin looks slightly different. Maybe heavier bracing shows inside. Maybe the shutters are thicker. Maybe the roofline is simpler. It is not a perfect home in a magazine sense. It is a home that learned. And even when the wind returns, because it always does, you stand in a structure that has been tested, damaged, and improved. Not invincible, not mythical, just more prepared. The cabin does not need to win against every storm. It needs to keep you safe enough to keep going, one repair at a time. The night comes with that soft, stretched out quality that happens after the weather has spent all its energy. The air feels rinsed. The stars look sharper, like somebody cleaned the lens of the sky. You step outside and the prairie is still wide, still honest. But calmer now, almost embarrassed about the tantrum it threw. The grass barely moves. The fence line stands in the dark like a quiet sketch. Even your breath sounds louder because the world is not roaring over it. You stand near your cabin and let your hand rest on the wall. It is warm where heat has seeped through from inside. It feels solid. It feels like a decision that held. Not a miracle, not a legend. Just a structure doing its job. The wind is not gone forever, but in this moment, it is not in charge. You go inside and the interior smells like wood smoke and earth, and the faint tang of work. Your tools are stacked. Your water is set. Your fire is stable. The cabin is not fancy, but it feels complete in the most important way. It is a place that can say no. A mainstream historical fact lives in the quiet where you settle in. As frontier regions developed, building practices gradually improved through shared experience, and communities adopted sturdier methods, from better joinery to stronger roof fastening, often influenced by what survived local storms and what could be built with available resources. Many early cabins were stepping stones toward more permanent homes, but the lessons from those cabins shaped later farmhouses and town buildings. Knowledge spread because survival demanded it. You sit and think about what stormproof really means, and you realise it is not one trick. It is a stack of small choices that work together. Site selection, shape, mass, connection, sealing, anchoring, maintenance. None of these is glamorous. Together, they make the difference between a night spent listening in fear and a night spent sleeping. Even if the wind tries to sing outside, a quirky tidbit comes to mind. The kind of thing people pass around when they're tired and trying to make meaning out of hard living. Some settlers claim you can tell a truly tight cabin by how steady a candle flame stays, even when wind is fierce outside. If the flame burns straight, the cabin is sealed well enough that pressure changes are not rushing through. It is not an official test, but it is a comforting one, and you decide you like it. You light a candle and watch. The flame flickers a little, then steadies. You let your shoulders drop. The wind can keep its opinions out there. Like joke number 1, gentle and sleepy, you realise you have just invented your own rating system. 5 out of 5 stars for does not let the weather slap me. Modern reviews wish they were that honest. You also think about the places where you compromised. The window that is smaller than you would like. The roofline that is plain. The door that looks like a barn door because it basically is. In calmer times, you might have wanted elegance. Here, you want reliability. And you learn that reliability has its own beauty. A blunt, practical beauty that feels like deep breath. Historians still argue whether the pioneer ideal of a rugged self-reliance is overstated, because many homesteads depended on neighbours for tools, advice, shared labour, and mutual aid in emergencies. The debate matters because it changes the story from lone hero to connected community. You can feel that truth in your bones. Even if you build with your own hands, you build with ideas learned from others and with help offered in rough seasons. The cabin is not only wood or stone or sod, it is shared knowledge made physical. You hear the sound of the night outside, and it is different now. Not the roar of wind, but a soft chorus of insects and distant animal calls. The cabin filters it into a low hush. You notice how the walls hold warmth, how the interior air feels still. You realise stillness is not only comfort, it is proof. It is evidence that the structure is doing its quiet job. Like joke number 2, you catch yourself feeling proud of your chinking work, which is a sentence you never expected to say. You're basically excited about mud. Your younger self would be confused. Your current self is tired and practical, and very impressed with mud's career arc. You add a final check before sleep, not because you're anxious, but because routine is soothing. You test the latch. You glance at the shutters, you make sure embers are safe, you set a blanket near your bed, you put a small repair bundle within reach, a bit of cloth, a bit of clay, a tool, not because you expect catastrophe tonight, but because preparedness calms the mind. It is like keeping an umbrella by the door. You do not summon rain by doing it, you just refuse to be surprised. You climb into bed and the mattress is whatever you could make it, maybe straw, maybe a quilt folded thick. Maybe something that squeaks. It is not luxury, but it is yours. The cabin holds your heat close, and the air feels thick with quiet. Your eyelids get heavy. The day's work settles in your arms and legs, the kind of tired that feels earned. Now you let your thoughts slow down, and you give yourself permission to drift. The prairie outside becomes a wide, dark ocean of grass, but your cabin is a small boat that knows how to stay upright. The roof is tied, the walls are thick, the corners are tight, the gaps are sealed, the base is anchored. The wind can return whenever it wants, but it will meet a structure that has learned how to resist without panic. You breathe in, you breathe out. The candle flame becomes a soft pulse, then you snuff it, and the darkness feels gentle instead of threatening. The sound of the world outside becomes a distant blanket of noise, like waves far away. The cabin holds, and that holding becomes a kind of lullaby. Your muscles unclench one by one, your jaw loosens, your hands, the same hands that cut, lifted, packed, and braced, finally rest. You can feel the warmth pooling under the blankets. You can feel the steady, still air around you. The stormproof work has done its job. Wind down now, slow and soft. You imagine the cabin from above, a small, low shape tucked into the land. Not fighting the prairie, simply cooperating with it. The grass around it sways in a mild night breeze. The stars wheel slowly. Everything moves at the pace of sleep. Your breathing stays even. The day fades. Nothing needs to be solved right now. Nothing needs to be fixed right now. The door is shut. The shutters are closed. The roof is steady. The walls are quiet. You're safe enough to let your mind go loose, to let the prairie become a calm picture in the dark. A wide sky, a steady cabin, a warm bed. Your thoughts grow softer. The edges blur. The last thing you feel is the solid certainty of shelter and the gentle rhythm of your own breath. Slow, steady, and drifting. End of script. Sweet dreams.